Hello, welcome to the final webinar in our series about bird migration. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of Zoom housekeeping, as I normally do at the beginning of this session. I'm Jamie, by the way. I work for the RSPB magazine team, lovely magazine you can see here. As this is a Zoom webinar, you won't be able to turn on your video or your microphone, but you will be able to ask us some questions using the Q&A box that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. If we don't get to all the questions during the session, we do our best. If we don't get to them, we'll try and answer them after the session, and we'll send an email around to everybody filling in the gaps. The session is being recorded. There's no chat function enabled for this event. If you have any technical issues, there is someone from the events team available who may be able to help you, but for some Zoom-related issues, we might not be able to offer any support. Now, as I said, this is the final session in our series on migration. And in this session, we're going to be bringing to life some of the incredible and little-known journeys of a number of migratory species. We're going to highlight how science has helped us understand more about these journeys and look at what the future might look like for some of these birds. Let's look at some really amazing journeys today. This is a good one. I'm telling you now, this is a good one. We're going to welcome the first of our speakers now, and we're going to hear about some of the myths and mysteries from the history of bird migration science. So I'm going to welcome Guy Anderson, the RSPB's Migratory Species Recovery Programme Manager, for a potted history of how our knowledge of migratory species and their journeys has developed. And here we go. Over to you, Guy.
Thank you, Jamie. Good afternoon, everyone. There was a clever chap in ancient Greece called Aristotle. He did a lot of thinking, and he thought long and hard about why some birds appeared in his Greek homeland in spring and then vanished again in autumn, whereas others appeared in the autumn and vanished in spring. And he was one of the earliest known writers to document this phenomenon. And he came up with some pretty imaginative ideas to explain what he saw. For example, he suggested that the birds might change their shape and appearance between the seasons, and he called this the theory of transmutation. So, for example, rather than going anywhere, maybe the nightingales that spend the summer in Greece simply changed their colour and shape to look a bit more like the redwings that appeared in winter. They are not so different in shape or size after all. And likewise, maybe the duck that we call the gargany, which is only seen in Europe in the summer, changes itself to look a bit more like, say, a widgeon, which are mostly only seen in winter, and so on and so forth. And then this theory of transmutation sounds fairly reasonable, really. After all, we know some birds really do change colour from summer to winter. They have different summer and winter plumages, and some even change their appearance altogether. So, for example, the ridiculously flamboyant male ruff in summer plumage really does turn into a much dowdier and very different looking creature in autumn. So was transmutation a crazy idea? No, not really. But it couldn't explain what was going on with the types of bird that seemed to vanish altogether during one season of the year, with nothing even vaguely similar appearing in their place, like the swallow. So swallows are here in the European summer, of course, and then they vanish in the autumn. So where are they in winter? Well, maybe they hibernate somewhere. Plenty of other animals hibernate. They spend the winter months dozing out of sight. Mammals, reptiles, amphibians, insects, they all do it. So why not birds? That would make sense. And the idea that swallows used to spend the winter hibernating in the mud at the bottom of ponds and lakes was again first documented by Aristotle. And then this idea persisted for nearly 2,000 years afterwards. And it's easy to see how it came about too, when people saw large numbers of swallows diving into reeds around ponds and lakes in the autumn, which of course they do, to roost there overnight is the reality. And then apparently these birds the next day, they vanished before they reappear the following spring, often around the same wetlands. That's what people saw. That's what people still see. So, and this idea that swallows might actually hibernate over winter was still being debated as a serious theory by ornithologists as late as the 1870s. But by then, the idea that larger birds at least might be capable of moving some distance from one season to another had become a bit more firmly established, although it took a while to work out where birds were actually going to. And a popular theory in the 18th century suggested that many birds might fly to the moon for the winter. And clearly here's some geese doing just that. Again, you can see why this idea might have come about. On moonlit nights in winter, wild geese really do fly about a lot and could look for all the world like they're heading towards the moon. So in the next 100 years following then, however, scholars and naturalists really started to learn more about where our wild birds really went to when they disappeared from us, although sometimes in rather unexpected ways. And one such case involves a white stork, and it's a rather unlucky stork, it has to be said. In a region of northeast Germany called Mecklenburg, about here, somewhere about there, on the 22nd of May, 1822, a hunter there found, shot, and killed a white stork, which had not long returned to its nesting area. Now, where those storks went to in winter was at that point still a complete mystery. Nobody knew. Now, the hunter saw that there was something a bit strange about this stork. It had what looked like a large arrow sticking out of its neck. And this arrow was identified by local scholars as actually a type of hunting spear used in Central Africa. So what had happened here was that this poor bird had narrowly escaped becoming somebody's dinner in the middle of Africa during the winter, and then had managed to fly thousands of miles back to Germany with the spear still embedded in its neck, only then to be shot. How unlucky is this? Now, this poor bird has become rather famous, and you can still see it on display as a specimen at the University of Rostock Museum in Germany. Now, I don't want to ruin your lunch, so anyone of a nervous disposition should probably look away now. This is the actual bird with the real spear that it managed to fly back to Germany with. Quite astonishing, but not alone. There have been reports of up to 25 white storks returning to Europe, carrying assorted bits of African weaponry with them. I mean, this is pretty gruesome and very unfortunate for this poor bird, but its significance was clear, because this was one of the very first pieces of hard evidence that birds like storks could actually, that birds that appeared in Europe in the summer really were traveling thousands of miles to Africa, where they would spend the winter. First bits of hard evidence. So maybe larger birds like storks really are capable of such journeys, but surely not the small ones, right? I mean, how on earth could small birds be capable of such feats of endurance on their own? Well, maybe they're not. Maybe they get help along the way. Take the goldcrest, for example. Every autumn, thousands of what is our smallest bird appear on the east coast of Britain, looking for all the world like they might have just flown across the North Sea. But surely that's not possible. A goldcrest weighs 5 grams, and it's at least 500 miles across the North Sea. That's crazy, surely. So what else is happening at the same time of year there? Oh look, other birds are appearing at the same place along the East Coast at the same time, including the cryptic and often hidden woodcock, a game bird that was long been considered to be a bit dim, a bit thick. So maybe that's the answer. The woodcock is physically capable of crossing the North Sea, but a bit dim and a bit likely to get lost. So needs something to guide it on the way. Maybe that's the goldcrest. This could be the perfect answer. So maybe the goldcrest sits on the back of the woodcock and guides it on its way. Therefore, both birds arrive in Britain at the same time and place. And this myth led to the goldcrest being given its old name of the woodcock pilot. And intriguingly, if you look across the Atlantic to the New World, exactly the same myth arose involving hummingbirds migrating south on the backs of geese. So since the time of Aristotle, people have come up with many imaginative ways to explain what they were witnessing birds doing. Transmutation, hibernation, flying to the moon, flying on the backs of other birds, all of which must have seemed more rational and probable than the alternative, frankly crazy notion that birds of all shapes and sizes could actually fly around the globe. But truth is often stranger than fiction. And so a little over 100 years ago, a game changer in our understanding of bird migration came along, and that was bird ringing. And what ringing allows you to do is to follow individual birds from one point in their life cycle to another. You put a ring with a unique number onto an individual bird and then find that bird again somewhere else in the future. And through the simple process, we have learned much of what we now know about bird migration, where birds migrate to, when they migrate, and how long it takes them. So ringing of birds has taught us a huge amount and continues to do so. But it does rely, sorry, my mistake. As a result of ringing, we know that millions of birds of thousands of different species travel huge distances every year, and that this happens all around the world. So, for example, we've got songbirds like swallows that nest here and then fly right down to South Africa to spend the winter. We've got seabirds like Arctic terns that breed here and then winter around the Antarctic oceans. Waders like turnstone that breed in the Arctic and come to us to spend the winter. And wildfowl like Brent geese, likewise, coming from the other direction, from Siberia in winter, again, to spend the winter with us. We are really lucky here. We sit on one of the world's bird superhighways. And maybe this is part of the reason why the British Isles have always played such a leading role in ornithology and producing so many eminent ornithologists. There's just so much fascinating bird stuff going on here. And ringing has taught us a huge amount and continues to do so. But it does rely on those ringed birds being found or caught or seen again wherever they go to. And this works fine for something like a swallow, which forms big communal roosts in reed beds or in tall crop fields on its migration and in winter. And particularly when it does this in areas where there are ornithologists to catch and study them. Now, lots of swallows have been ringed in the British Isles since our ringing scheme started in 1909. Now, this map is from the British Trust for Ornithology, and it shows the locations of where swallows that were originally ringed in the British Isles were then found subsequently. So each blue dot represents an individual bird. Now, lots of those were found close to home, not surprisingly, but also, if you look closely, you'll see a chain of dots going down through Europe and through Africa. And we can basically play join the dots to reveal the migration route and the wintering areas. And this is how we know that many of our swallows winter as far away as South Africa. But this doesn't always work so well. House martins, for example, are closely related to swallows, so you'd think the same theory would apply. Now, lots of them have also been ringed in the British Isles, and joining the dots for house martins also leads us on a route down through Europe into North Africa. But there the trail goes cold. Now, we know house martins don't winter in North Africa. There are no sightings there in the winter. There are lots of sightings, however, of house martins flying around in winter all across Africa, but south of the Sahara. And there's only one recovery of a house martin ringed in the British Isles south of the Sahara, here in Nigeria. Just the one. So what's going on here? So, well, we still don't know for sure, but it's possible that house martins behave much more like swifts in winter. In other words, they just keep flying and rarely, if ever, land. And if birds hardly ever land, it makes them rather hard to catch and definitely very hard to read their ring numbers on. So this is our best guess at the moment. House martins might not land very much in winter, and therefore we might not understand very much about them just from bird ringing, because we can't do so. So the house martins that nest here could be spending their winters anywhere in this big area south of the Sahara. We just don't know yet. And if we don't know where migratory birds travel to, it makes it very hard to know what problems they might be facing, wherever they are when they're not here with us. However, thanks to some recent technological advances, we are now able to reveal the truth behind some of our remaining migration mysteries. But that's the next story.
Thank you very much, Guy. That's the history covered by Guy. Now let's look at the recent technological advances that have allowed us to learn so much more about familiar migratory species. To tell us a bit more about this fascinating subject, we have Malcolm Burgess, Principal Conservation Scientist from the RSPB's Conservation Science Department. Welcome, Malcolm.
Hi there. Hi, everyone.
Hello. So, Malcolm, how does tracking advance our knowledge and understanding? What does tracking do that ringing can't?
Yeah, so as Guy mentioned, the ringed birds need to either be recaptured or found and reported to provide any information. So the limitation of bird ringing is that it's only typically telling us information about the two locations. So little can be inferred about their behaviour. This is especially true for the smaller birds. We have more information for larger birds. So yeah, there's lots of extra detail that tracking devices provide. Now, firstly, tracking provides information about timing. So that means that we can know when they arrive and depart, their breeding sites, their wintering sites, and the stopover sites in between. And it also means we know the duration of time that they spend at those places as well. So that helps us identify the more critical places and when these places are particularly important. But, you know, for conservation, because so few ring birds are reported outside Europe, you know, the simplest advance, if you like, is knowing where our declining species go, which we, like the house martin example, like for many birds, we didn't, like the house martin, we didn't know this with any real certainty. We just have these blobs from these distribution maps. And, you know, we're interested in, for example, knowing which part of that blob UK breeding birds are going.
So in the first webinar, we focused very much on swifts, and this is a species that you've tracked. I think you've got a nice map of their migration. Can you show us that? See if we can get it up on the screen.
Yeah, that's the wrong. I was gonna. There we go. That's fine.
There we go.
Yes. So swifts, we actually had a project tracking swifts when they were foraging to understand their sort of foraging behavior when they're feeding chicks. But some of these birds were difficult to catch, and some of them got away. So we accidentally got some migration information. And here you see an example of that, one of those birds here. So this was a bird that was breeding in Northumberland, and in the red line there, you can see it first did a circuit of England and Wales back to the colony, and then it started on its migration, went through France and Spain, spent a little bit of time in Spain, and then over the Sahara Desert, and it just sort of continued to that sort of central region of Africa. So that's the rainforests over the Congo. So we know, of course, how important rainforests are and how biodiverse they are, but perhaps we don't think so often about that richness is true of the skies above these rainforests as well. And the swifts are spending a few weeks, a couple of months even, feeding over these rainforests, and then from there they move across to the east coast of Africa, and there they're actually really coastal, feeding along the coastline of Mozambique. And then the blue line is the return journey. It goes not the shortest way, goes back across Africa all the way to Western Africa and Liberia, where a lot of our migratory birds spend some time in early spring. Must be a particularly good area for food in sort of April time. This is, and then it makes a fairly quick and direct route across the Sahara again, back through Spain, and back to exactly the same nest site that it used the previous year.
It's incredible, isn't it? Some of these birds will spend more than a year actually on the wing, won't they? They won't come and land.
That's right. Yeah. So we think that swifts are airborne for pretty much all of the time. Really, they will very occasionally. Obviously, they land when they breed, but yes, they very rarely land during the rest of the year. So yeah, airborne all the time.
Incredible birds. Now, what I should have asked you is about the tracking devices themselves. So let's take a step back and look at those, because I think this is really interesting, because these are incredible little things. Could you introduce us to them, please, Malcolm?
Yeah, so there's lots of tracking devices out there now. I'm struggling to keep up. There's lots of manufacturers of them as well. So so these are the three most sort of commonly used types of tag, if you like. And I'll start at the top. And these are satellite tags, which come in all sizes, as you can see there. These tend to be the larger tags because they transmit the data through the satellite network back to us. So they need some power to do that. So that's why they're a bit bigger. But they are as light as 2 grams now. I think the big advance in tracking technology is everything's got miniaturized, and that's what's enabled us to study so many smaller birds as well. So in the middle there, we've got GPS tag, the middle weight range, if you like. Most of these are larger and transmit the data that they collect. GPS tags work just like an old GPS unit, or this technology is in our mobile phones now as well. But these have been miniaturized down to a gram. So that's with tracker I just described there. that had one of these tags that weighed just 1 gram, although we did have to catch the bird to get the data out of that, because at 1 gram doesn't have enough power to transmit that. And then at the bottom there, these are the tags that I use mostly in my work, and these are really tiny. These are what we call geolocators or multi-sensor loggers. These can weigh less than, well, as small as 0.3 grams, and that is really not very much at all. And these are very clever things. They record light levels, and from that's how we work out where the birds are, from the time of sunrise and sunset and midday from that. And these probably aren't going to get any smaller, but they are recording more things. So these loggers now also record temperature, and they also record air pressure, which means that we can know the altitude the bird was flying at. So yeah, things are still moving on in this world.
That's amazing. Why is it difficult to track migratory birds? I mean, we've talked about some of these things need power, don't they? So what are the obstacles that you faced doing this work?
Yes, it's not as easy as it might seem tracking birds. There's lots of reasons. I'll give a couple of reasons. Firstly, is actually the need, obviously, to catch the bird to fit the tag in the first place. And if the tag is one of the types that doesn't transmit the data, that means we have to catch the same bird the year after to get the data out of it. And so this is, obviously really challenging, and we are sort of quite selective about the populations that we track, so that we're pretty confident that we'll get some of this information back. But you can imagine the year after fitting the tag, we have to re-find the same bird, catch it again, and that can be very, very challenging sometimes. And secondly, yeah, indeed. So secondly, sort of analysing the data as well is not so bad for satellite and GPS tags, because they provide latitude and longitudes in the data that we download. But these geolocators, it takes a lot of work to interpret the light data that it gives us back. And the methods for that, this is all very new, and the methods are new as well and evolving. And you can work out the migratory journey of a bird, and then by the time you finish doing it, there's a new method out there that you might have to learn and do it again. That certainly happened to me a few times.
So finally, we've looked at Swifts already, but are there any other kind of exciting findings that you've come across over the last few years involving the tracking work?
Yeah, so the work I've been involved with is focused on smaller birds, and we've worked out where UK breeding wood warblers, whinchats, spotted flycatchers, pied flycatchers go, and the routes they take, and just sort of pull out some of those. Wood warblers is quite a different one. They actually go to Italy during August. They actually spend all of August in Italy, and they go over the Sahara. Remember, wood warblers only weigh about 10 grams. And they spend 4-6 weeks in the very sort of dry areas of the Sahel, sparsely wooded area there. And then they move on to West Africa, the sort of humid tropical forest areas for the rest of the winter, and then migrate due north back to us. So that's what we call a circular migration. Spotted flycatchers, they go much further. They go to Angola, South Africa. Whinchats, they spread over a really large area of Western Africa, stretching from Mali to Nigeria. So they can go to any places in between there. While the pied flycatcher makes a pretty simple migration in comparison to a very small area of Western Africa, where we've been able to then go and study them in Liberia.
Thank you. Now, if anyone watching read Notes on Nature, our email at the weekend, we did say that there is a bird that does a circular migration, but also has a spinning song. And I thought that was a lovely link, because the wood warbler, its song does sound like a spinning coin, doesn't it?
That's right, it does. Yeah, when it's breathing, it is. Yes.
Obviously, it just likes that shape. Thank you so much, Malcolm. That was fascinating. We're now going to go and have a chat with Sam Lee from the RSPB's Global Species Recovery Team, and Tara Proud from RSPB Scotland, to bring some more of these migratory journeys to life. Welcome, Sam and Tara. Hello.
Hi, Jamie. Thanks for inviting me to talk in this webinar.
It's quite all right. I'm just seeing if Sam's there as well. There she is. Hello, Sam. Hello. Let's start with Tara. So you manage a very interesting project. I'm going to let you talk about it, because you could describe it much better than I can. Go ahead, Tara.
Thanks, Jamie. So yeah, I manage a project called Corncrake Calling. So we're working to protect this species, the corncrake, and they sound like this. So I wonder how many folk who are listening to this webinar have heard that call. Now, corncrakes are really fascinating birds. They spend their summer breeding here in the islands off the west coast of Scotland.
I'm just thinking of that noise. It's unreal. It's extraordinary, isn't it? And
It
I think it's
is.
often compared to sort of like rubbing up like the finger along a comb, something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. Really bizarre noise. And there's nothing quite like the sound when you're in the middle of the summer, in the middle of the night, and you hear that.
I would love to hear one. What is it about the corncrake that's drawn you to working on them, and why are they so special to you?
So, well, I'm really fascinated by long distance migration, and that's definitely one of the reasons why I'm passionate about corncrakes. But also on a personal level, I live in the Western Isles of Scotland, so this is one of the sort of remaining places where corncrakes still breed in the summer. And the sound of corncrakes, that like almost mechanical, repetitive cracks in the middle of the night in the summertime, is just so evocative, and it's got a cultural significance here.
So let's look at that migration route. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so using the geolocators that Malcolm was just talking about, their migration route was discovered back in about 2011. And that's when 5 male corncrakes who were tagged here in Scotland travelled down to Europe, following the route you can see on the slide, into Africa. And after flying over the Sahara, which I just think is mind-blowing whenever I consider a bird doing this, they took a break. They stopped off in West Africa, so some in Ghana, some in Nigeria. And then after presumably feeding up a bit, they carried on down into Central Africa, so the Congo Basin. And that's where they spend most of their winter. And then subsequent research has actually found that whilst they're in the Congo rainforest, they like to hang out with forest elephants. Now, it's just incredible, and a lot of people watching this probably didn't expect us to talk about elephants at all, but corncrakes and elephants actually hang out together in forest clearings, and we think it's because the elephants trampling around in long grass provides the kind of habitat structure that corncrakes need for foraging on the ground. Again, Malcolm mentioned how rich in food these forests are, whereas the swifts are flying above the canopy, the corncrakes are right on the ground. And we think this is also why they like hanging out with Highland cows when they're here in Scotland. They create a similar habitat.
They create some habitat, and of course, those large animals are attracting insects as well, aren't they? And sort of
Yeah.
stirring them up in their wake as they move through the grass. Um, can you tell us a bit about some of the threats that these birds are facing and what you're doing to protect them?
Yeah, absolutely. So corncrakes used to be found right across Scotland, in fact, all across the UK. Even as recently as about 100 years ago, they were reported as calling in central Edinburgh, and they actually appeared in popular cookbooks of the day because they were so abundant. Yeah, but now the population is much lower, and they're found mainly on the islands off the west coast of Scotland. And the reasons are largely due to changes in farming practices. So corncrakes really in fact, they rely upon long grass and nettles and irises, so kind of vegetation that will give them food and places to hide from predators. That's what the males are looking for when they return from migration. That's where they call from at this time of year, in the middle of the night to attract a mate. That's where the nest is built, they incubate and then raise their chicks. And so this long vegetation is providing these super cute chicks that you can now see on the screen. This long vegetation provides exactly what they need, food and protection from predators. But unfortunately for corncrakes, farming practices have changed. So mowing, for example, mowing of grass is happening earlier in the year than it used to. And also tractors and other farm machinery are now bigger and faster and more efficient than they were. And corncrakes do not like running across short cut grass, and that makes them very vulnerable to being accidentally killed by farming machinery. So a big part of this project, Corncrake Calling, is working with farmers and crofters communities so that the field can be mowed a bit later, so after the corncrakes have fledged, beyond that vulnerable time I just described, and in a corncrake friendly way. So I mean, we start the cutting in the centre of the field and then the tractor rotates out to the edge. And that just allows the corncrakes to move through the grass to safety on the edges of the fields. And we're also working with farmers and crofters to create more of that long vegetation that we know that corncrakes need.
Thank you so much, Tara. And when you explained it like that, it sounds like such a simple, obvious solution, didn't it? It's not something that's costing anymore. You simply start your process in a different location in the field. Thank you very much. Let's move on to Sam. Sam, please can you introduce yourself and explain which migratory species you work for? I was going to say you work for. I suppose you do work for them. You work on for the RSPB.
Thanks, Jamie. Yeah, hello, and hi to everyone watching this wherever you might be. So I am a Senior Species Recovery Officer for RSPB, and I work as part of a team that focuses on working to stop the declines of some of our most threatened species. And the species that I work on is the Eurasian curlew. I'll just call it the curlew from now on. It's the only one we get in the UK. It's the UK's largest breeding wader and one of our highest avian conservation priorities.
I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Tara. What's drawn you to working with curlews, and why are they special to you?
So to start off with, I think it's our global responsibility of how important the UK is for curlews worldwide, actually. So over a quarter of all breeding curlew use UK habitats to nest and rear their chicks. So whatever we do here really has these worldwide implications and can really affect just this species sort of existence worldwide and into the future. So it's definitely that critical component that we are to their global survival. Also, curlew are what we call like an umbrella species. So that means habitat management we do for curlew actually benefits a whole host of other species. And a report commissioned by Natural Resources Wales actually demonstrated that 84 different types of species benefit for some of the habitat management we do for curlews. And that's everything. It's not just other birds, but it includes other endangered species, plant species, and invertebrates as well. So they can also be really good indicators of healthy habitats and ecosystems. And I guess lastly, sort of like Tara, it's that personal connection that you have with the species. So to me, curlews just are really part of my experience of the natural environment. And just like everyone at the moment is looking for seeing their sort of first swift and their first swallows, I just love hearing that bubbling cry of the males at the start of breeding season. I find it really uplifting. And there's just, I know that people call it sort of a melancholy kind of call, but I just think that there's nothing else that sounds like a curlew. And so if we lost that sound from the countryside, it couldn't be replaced by anything else. So I personally find it uplifting and hope that I always get to hear it. And hopefully we've got a snippet of sound for people that might not have heard it yet.
Oh, okay. It's that sound in the back, and that kind of building sound, isn't it? I'm really familiar with that. I grew up on the North Kent coast, and out on the marshes, sea salter, we would hear that, and it's just, yeah, again, you get quite attached to those sounds that you grew up with, and amazing. Love these birds. Can you tell us about their migratory route? Where do they go?
Yeah, so curlews are a bit strange actually on migration, and almost everything we know so far is, like Guy mentioned earlier, almost entirely down to ringing records and sort of re-sightings of colour marked birds. But right now, as we speak, most birds will be sat on their eggs and waiting for their chicks to hatch. So this is a picture of a bird on typical breeding habitat, and they're going to be breeding inland on areas of rough pasture, sort of moorland, peatland bogs, and hay meadows, using spaces that have nice wet features to feed on and sort of different heights of vegetation so that they can hide their nests and keep a lookout. But generally speaking, after breeding season, around mid-July, some of these birds will be starting to think about moving off to their wintering grounds around the coasts and sort of estuaries. And broadly speaking, they move in a southwest direction rather than a lot of birds. So like with the corncrake, where they move sort of from the UK down to Africa. Curlew don't move to any specific place, they just sort of move in a general direction. So for example, birds that might be breeding on the east side of Scotland, they tend to move west, southwest, and they'll spend winter on the southwest of Scotland or northwest of England. So some of these sort of easterly breeding birds you might see at places like RSPB Merse Head, Morecambe Bay. The more westerly sort of Scottish breeding birds, they might actually go slightly further and nip across the Irish Sea. And in fact, one of our colour marked birds breeding in inch marshes up in the Cairngorms was actually spotted wintering down in County Clare in Ireland. You'll see that some of our lowland breeding birds, so those breeding sort of the Somerset levels around Oxfordshire, so our Otmore breeding birds, they're more likely to go down southwest and winter in Europe. But no UK breeding bird has been resighted any further south than Portugal. You might notice there's a bit of a dot on Orkney, one of our most important places for breeding curlew, and that's because they've had a really long-running colouring scheme. And actually, Orkney birds are even more odd because it seems to be that although some of them have been resighted elsewhere, actually a lot seem to be staying on Orkney. So they might be moving to different areas and again moving to those coastal areas, but they seem to like Orkney so much that they're actually staying all year round. But come winter, we will get large supplements of birds moving in from Fennoscandia. So those other arrows coming from sort of Norway, Finland, Estonia, they're birds that are going to come and spend winter here in the UK. So they'll mix up and supplement our UK breeding birds and sort of swell our numbers to something like 125,000 curlew, which can really help mask the problem because people think that there's loads of them, but these are actually birds that have bred elsewhere. And this is what their wintering habitat looks like. They're feeding on mollusks and worms over winter. And last year I was really lucky that I managed to go to spend some time with researchers over in Estonia, met with a bird that was breeding in Estonian farmland, and it actually was then resighted wintering on the coast of Northumberland. So yeah, it's just so important if you're out and about and you spot colouringed birds, do report those sightings because that's where we're building this picture of where they go for their migration.
Nice bit of citizen science there for everyone to join in with who gets to see one of those colouring birds. Can you tell us a bit about some of the threats that these birds are facing and how you're working to protect them, please?
Yeah, so ultimately driving curlew declines, and this is a species that's declined essentially by half in a period of about 25 years from 1995, is poor breeding success. So these lovely cute chicks, our adult breeding curlew, I find it really difficult to get them to fledgling, to successfully get these chicks flying out and about to sustain the population. But once they do fledge, actually annual survival is really quite good. So that's why we're focusing our efforts on that nesting and chick rearing period. And it's quite similar to some of the things that have already been mentioned. So habitat loss as a result of a change in land use can be an issue for curlew. So for example, poor planning for tree planting can actually directly remove habitat for some of our ground nesting birds. We also know that woodland planting in inappropriate places, actually some birds avoid their nesting within a certain distance from that woodland edge. So it can be up to 500 to a kilometre from the edge that birds will avoid nesting or will experience higher levels of predation the closer that they nest. That intensification of farming, so changes in cutting regimes, higher stocking densities and drainage, removing those important foraging habitats also has an impact. But curlews are a species that also rely on farming systems. So whilst high stocking densities can certainly cause accidental damage to nests, they can compact the ground, making it more difficult to feed. Equally, we don't want to lose grazing altogether or some of these farming practices because that's what can make the habitat really good. So if land is abandoned and no farming practicing takes place, actually the vegetation can sometimes become too dense and overgrown to also be unsuitable. And sort of the third big thing is really that the UK has very high levels of generalist predators, and we know that predation of young chicks and eggs is a big issue for curlew, but it's likely that that is a cause of habitat loss and predation as well. So it's a real challenge, and there's a lot of complex things interacting, but one of the really important pieces of work that we're doing is working alongside our farmers and land managers to get habitat management right so that we can manage farmland sensitively for curlews by providing advice and support, helping farmers to access some funding to help them to do that, and also advocating that future policies do provide financial support to help land managers to manage sensitively for wildlife on their farms. But we also have a number of our own reserves that support breeding curlew. And this is a really nice picture of one of our reserves in Scotland called Aird's Moss. And I just think it really well summarises sort of the mosaic of habitats that curlews need, but also helps to summarise a lot of the work that we do both off our reserves by working with land managers, but also on our reserves as well by our brilliant site managers and wardens. So here at Aird's Moss, you can see this mosaic of habitat from the peatlands in the background to these wet areas in the foreground and all this grassland as well. And you can see there's a real variation in habitats and structures. And actually a lot of the work that they've been doing at Aird's Moss tackles quite a few of these issues. So you can see it's a really open landscape. Yes, there is planting around it, but on the reserve itself, we're not creating any sort of woodland because that would be an inappropriate place to put it. We've also created these wetlands, but they were put in over winter, and they've created some really nice foraging habitats for a multitude of species. They've started to phase out grazing of sheep, and they've introduced Highland cattle, so fewer animals, so less chance of nests being accidentally trampled, but also just a better grazing regime. Highland cattle are hardy species, they can spend all year out feeding. And we've also removed fence lines. So we're removing some of the features that can actually make habitats favourable to some of our generalist predators that might use linear features, for example. So actually we've removed the fencing. We're using what's called no fence collars to help control the movement of our cattle. And in some areas like in Geltsdale, we've just started to use them on sheep as well. So that's really exciting. We're removing perch points such as odd bits of scrub that are in inappropriate places. And like I said, avoiding planting in key places. And in some areas, so in some of our reserves and landscapes, they're in populations that are really limited. So over in Northern Ireland on our Lower Lough Erne Reserve, for example, we're actually we've installed a predator exclusion fence, thankfully provided by funding from the EU as part of the Curlew Life project. And there we've got these permanent predator exclusion fence. And in other areas, again, where populations are really limited, so Northern Ireland, there's as few as 150 pairs, so every nest counts. We will also use temporary nest predation fences to protect nests from predation, and we're working with farmers to find out where curlew are nesting. So I was out on Hadrian's Wall the other week, and they're doing that in some of those farming areas as well. So it's really important that we demonstrate what we can do and get the habitat management right on our reserves, that we work with our farmers really closely to provide that advice and support for them to get it right. And it's really great to see groups of farmers coming together as well, working with really important national partners. So in England, there's the Curlew Recovery Partnership. In Wales, there's Gilford Cymru, and Scotland, there's working with waders to really share that knowledge and recognising that curlew declines is going to take efforts of many people, many different stakeholders. So it's important that we all work together, and also engaging with communities, because at the end of the day, these are important species to them. We're getting volunteers trained up in delivering nest fencing, we're working with farmers, and it's really great to see them taking ownership of a species that's right on their doorstep as well. So I think with all this work, and it's a huge range of conservation techniques and effort across the board, I, for one, remain really optimistic for the future of curlew.
Thank you very much, Sam and Tara. And as you've heard there's a lot around kind of the cultural aspect of these birds and communities. And I know that Sam and Tara are doing incredible work. Did a previous webinar with Sam, and she modelled, I think, a lovely curlew hat. You can actually get a curlew knitting pattern to make a curlew hat. So there's all sorts of things. Get people really enthused and inspired about the birds that should be around them. Now we're going to move on to weather forecasts. So Luke, our resident forecaster, we've had a fascinating few weeks to see which birds are arriving and departing. Birds and the migrations are incredible. So I think, there's currently an exhibition at the Natural History Museum about birds, brilliant, bizarre. We can send you some more details about that in the email that we send around after the session. In the meantime, Luke, how's the bird migration weather looking?
Yeah, pretty interesting to be honest. Although what I'm going to do is quickly reflect on last week's before we go into the fantastic hobby, because each week, if you haven't been for the last few weeks of the webinars, we've been doing these sort of weekly forecasts of what birds might show up. And last week I mentioned nightjars, and it has been a great week for nightjars. So I was kind of right on that front, which is good. But I learned something that I didn't know, which I had to share with everybody. That off Dorset last week, somebody saw nightjars at dusk, so not when it was dark, flying around out to sea, which is really unusual, really bizarre. And this is something that's been seen in the past. And what's the theory around it is that the nocturnal birds, the nightjar, they're not willing to kind of come onto land from their migration until it gets dark. So they just linger around out to sea. So that's bizarre, something I never knew about nightjars. Yet another weird fact about a crazy bird. But anyway, into this week's forecast, which wasn't easy, to be fair. We're into sort of mid-May now, which is, from a migration point of view, lots and lots of birds are in and the breeding season's well underway. So a bit of a weird one to predict for this week. However, I've gone for a hobby. Now, hobbies have been arriving already, but the thing I want to flag this week is that as kind of warmer weather starts to come in, or hopefully more warmer weather starts to come in through the rest of the month, hobbies do something fantastic. They can gather at wetlands, and that tends to coincide with the emergence of dragonflies, particularly four-spot chaser dragonflies. And a reserve not far from me, I'm down in Dorset, but I occasionally go up to Somerset to Ham Wall, which is an RSPB nature reserve there. And I've seen a real spectacle in sort of mid-late May of around 30 to 40 hobbies, all feeding on dragonflies. And as you can see from that picture there, they catch them in the air, which is a remarkable thing to do. And what they're doing, they're just kind of gathering. They've all arrived in the UK. They're having a bit of a feed up because these birds don't breed until quite late in the year. They don't tend to lay eggs until sort of early mid-June. So they're basically just kind of feeding up. And yeah, nice little welcome back to the UK in terms of eating lots and lots of dragonflies. But this is a bird, you can see on the map there actually, that this is a bird that tends to be more southerly in its distribution. However, it is a bird that we've seen that's moved north in recent years and increased actually in the UK. So there might be some links there to climate change based on the summer weather that we get and the abundance of dragonflies and other insects that they eat further north. But there is populations in Scotland. So if you're anywhere in the UK, do look out for hobbies. They could turn up anywhere. So on to the next species. A bit of a curveball potentially. A quail. Now, most people, well, certainly my younger years of bird watching when I was a kid, I spent lots of my years looking at bird books and stuff. And to be honest, quail wasn't really a bird that was really on my radar as a kind of UK species as such. And I think that might be the case for lots of other bird watchers, really. It's a really unusual thing to think about. But it's a summer migrant in the UK. They do turn up, and there has been some reports, and could be a sign that this summer might be quite a good year for quail. They tend to breed in farmland, in arable crops, or sort of nice old traditional hay meadows where there's lots of insect life. But this bird is prone to kind of eruption years. So some years we can see more than others. And part of the reason to do with that is they've got a really bizarre migratory breeding strategy. So birds can breed almost year round, way further south in North Africa and Spain. And quail can breed at around, well, as little as 12 weeks old, they can actually start breeding. So birds that are bred further south, they just keep pushing north. Young birds keep pushing north as well. And the population just keeps going further north until basically they have to turn around because the kind of weather's probably turned by then and they need to go back south again. But listen out their fantastic call. Reminds you of somebody saying, wet my lips. There we go, wet my lips. That's my quail impression for the day. But on to the next species, another bird of prey. And this is one of our rarest breeding birds in Britain. But one that turns up generally sort of in May. So if you're incredibly lucky and in the right sort of areas, you might get a glimpse of a honey buzzard. It's one of my favorite birds. I hadn't seen a honey buzzard until I was kind of in my early 20s. And it was a real thrill to see because I knew that this was a special bird. It's very rare. It only comes here for the summer. It is very similar to our common buzzard. And they do, there's lots and lots of pitfalls in terms of identification. And that's probably a whole webinar in itself, kind of honey buzzard migration. So I'm not going to dwell on it now. But great birds. They're called honey buzzards, not because they eat honey. They tend to feed on lots of wasp and bee grubs. They kind of go in and raid nests and take the grubs out. Also prone to amphibians as well. They rather like a toad or a frog to eat as well. But again, from that map, you can see that there is a sort of patchy distribution around the UK. There's a few locations where they do breed, so Central Wales, some of the southern counties, North Yorkshire's not bad, and a few patches in Scotland. But there might be as little as maybe 150 pairs in the whole of the country. So this is a rare bird. But one thing it does is got a fantastic display, and a male in full display is a wonderful thing to see. Now, they tend to do a thing called, we call it wing clapping. They're not technically actually clapping. Their wings never actually meet and they don't make a noise. But common buzzards don't do that sort of wing clapping type thing. So if you see a bird of prey over some gorgeous old woodland, wing clapping away, could be a honey buzzard. But yeah, if you're very lucky. Next species is another bit of a rarity. And I looked at the weather forecast yesterday, and I noticed that the winds were kind of in a bit of an easterly direction later on this week. And for the next few days, it seemed to be sort of quite southerly. And the southerly winds kind of only come up from sort of northern France, maybe the Bay of Biscay. So nothing kind of to cause birds to travel vast distances. But later this week, there's a nice easterly push. Now, redback shrikes tend to breed in East Europe, Northeast Europe. Occasionally, they have been known to breed in Britain, but that is a kind of real rare event. So if they do turn up in the next week, there'll probably be birds on their way to Northeast Europe. But that easterly wind has caused them to drift towards the UK. And generally, I'd imagine the East Coast, anywhere along the East Coast, there's a better chance. But brilliant birds. The shrikes generally, they're sometimes referred to as butcher birds because they're quite predatory in their nature, but they are actually a songbird. They're not a bird of prey. They use their beak to catch all sorts of prey. And you can see it sitting on some bramble there, and they've got a tendency to stab their prey onto thorns and use that as effectively a knife and fork to be able to rip their prey apart. So that's a redback shrike. If you're really, really lucky, that's one to look out for. That's as ambitious as I kind of got with my predictions this week. But to be honest, though, Jamie, I made a prediction, didn't I, a few weeks ago about collared flycatcher, and I wondered if I'd throw in another bit of a rarity this week in terms of something for the next week. Yeah, I'm going to go broad-billed sandpiper.
Wow, where would that be from?
So they way over in the northeast of Europe again. So the link to that easterly wind. But yeah, hard one to pick out. And I think it was last week I mentioned about breeding plumage waders, looking out for these sort of Arctic waders moving north in their summer finery. But yeah, if you can pick out a broad-billed sandpiper in the next week, then yeah, well done you.
Wow, lots to look out for there. And we do get reports through to the magazine, actually, of people finding nightjars in their gardens. Is that unusual?
Well, I mean, it is unusual, but yeah, not impossible. So as they migrate further north, birds can effectively stop off anywhere. That's one of the brilliant things about this time of year, is that anything can sort of show up anywhere. And yeah, if a nightjar finds a nice safe place to pitch up on its migration, then yeah, I think I've seen sort of similar pictures. They're often sitting on like a shed roof or a friend's post or something. They're
thinking they're camouflaged.
Yeah, just not very successfully. So
yeah, you never know what might turn up close to you. We've popped a poll on the screen to see if you can tell us which species migrates the furthest. And as soon as I see the results, I'll read them out to you. But otherwise, we're going to start gathering people back for the Q&A. Because we've got a few questions that we can answer here, I think. Yeah, we've deliberately done a misspelling of Arctic tern there. It's a just to test you all, because of course TERN. Thank you, Doug, for pointing that one out. So let's get everyone back on the screen. And the poll's gone. Let's see if it pops back up and tells me what we thought. Okay, yeah, everyone's gone for the slightly differently spelled Arctic tern, the alternative spelling of Arctic tern. Yeah, Arctic tern we would say does go the furthest. We talked about it a bit in the first one. Guy's nodding, so I feel confident I'm saying the right thing. Oh, thank you all. Okay, so let's go through the questions. A very quick, easy one from Fiona and Jan and Alan saying, can we watch these webinars afterwards? Yes, you can. After each one, we do send out an email with a link, and we'll aim to in this final email that you'll get after this session, we'll put a link to all 4 recordings on there. It does take a little bit of time because what we like to do is make sure we've got the subtitles set up properly on YouTube so that people can understand what they're watching and hearing. So yeah, thank you. Glad you all want to see these again. Let's have a look at some other questions. This is an interesting one from Derek. How does a young bird who's born in this country, like an osprey or a swallow, know how to return? And who wants to take that one? I'm looking at Guy or Luke or Malcolm or Tara or Sam. Guy.
Yes. I will.
Yes.
To know how to return. So,
Yes.
so we think a lot of migration behaviour is based on sort of innate hardwired cues. There's birds respond to the day length, maybe sometimes temperature, sort of internal cues like hormonal changes, and they've evolved to respond to those external cues and go right at that point in time when the day length gets to that, I need to go that way for 3 days and then stop and turn right a bit. That's what my hardwired brain tells me. And if that works and they get somewhere and survive, and then the same process happens the next year, they come back and hopefully come back, survive, and end up somewhere where they can breed successfully, they'll just keep doing the same thing. If a route works for a migratory bird and it allows it to survive and then breed, it'll just keep doing it. It'll try to keep doing it forevermore. That's what we think happens. There's a lot of hardwired, innate behavior that's evolved in birds.
And we talked about this in previous sessions, how like some birds can obviously travel with their families, with their parents, ducks, geese, swans, but then other birds are growing up completely separate, like the cuckoo. A cuckoo it must have that little innate thing hardwired into the brain to know where to go to.
Yeah, we notice it. We notice it most in cuckoos because, of course, the adult cuckoos have left long before the cuckoo chick has left the nest and is then independent. But actually, the independence of young birds very soon after leaving the nest. That's the norm. Most bird species, the adults, basically abandon the young very soon after they've fledged, they've left the nest, and they're on their own. There's only a few species, like, as you said, cranes and geese and swans, where the young stay with their parents for most of the first year of their life. So they migrate with them, hang around over winter together, and then often migrate back north with them as well. That's rare.
And also, Jamie, just it was an example this morning. This is kind of hot off the press. I saw this on social media this morning, but somebody, you mentioned osprey in that question, and there's been ospreys breeding in the south coast of England, which is a project with Roy Dennis Foundation and Birds of Poole Harbour. It's been great to sort of reintroduce them to that area. But the first chick to have fledged in the south coast, kind of in recent centuries, returned back this morning. It came back and sat on the nest in Poole Harbour. So somebody got a photograph of the ring number, and so that's a massive boost for the project down here on the south coast.
Oh, that's a lovely, heartwarming story. Very, very good news for those birds. Let's have a look at what other questions we've got. Margaret says, do we have a theory about why some bird species have evolved to stay resident and some have to migrate? I think we've touched on it slightly in previous ones. I'm going to look to Guy for this one because I think we have talked about this a little bit before.
Yeah. So the whole sorry about the helicopter noise outside, by the way, if you can hear that. One of the theories behind how we think migration is evolved is all about using resources that are temporarily available for part of the year. So imagine a bird that's living in the tropics, nice stable environment, could be lots of food around, great for hanging around there all year, but there's potentially lots of competition there, lots of other things that want to eat the same foods. Yeah. So if you can take advantage of resources that are available somewhere else during the northern summer to do the hard work of breeding and producing young, because that's hard work, then that is potentially an opportunity. And if that strategy works, it will spread and spread through population through evolution. That's how we think it's happened. It depends a bit on what resources those species need. This is particularly true maybe for insectivorous birds, for example, or birds that are relying on food resources, or indeed nest site resources that are only available for a particular portion of the year in the particular area of the world that they're moving to. And then when those resources are not there, they have to get out and go somewhere else.
Thank you. I'm so sorry, Malcolm. I spotted you wanted to answer that one, but I have got another question for you. So how do you attach a geolocator to a smaller bird?
Okay, yeah. So I do have a tiny one here, but I don't think it will work very well on the camera. Or maybe it will against my shiny forehead. You can just about see a little harness there. So basically, it's a little bit of stretchy material, and it basically fits like a backpack. So it's a bit like wearing a very, very small rucksack. And yes, we put that on, and it's got a flexible harness, so it does sort of adapt to the size of the bird over the year.
Oh, lovely. Thank you very much. Now, we are running out of time, sadly, and we have got lots of other questions, which, as I promised, we will try and answer after the session. I'm just going to fire a quick one over at Tara, because I know Tara wants to answer this one. Jan says, heard but not seen in the Outer Hebrides. And I think that must have been in context of corncrakes.
Yes, yeah. I just wanted to say, so yeah, quite often you will only hear them and not see them because of the calling in the middle of the night, and also calling from long grass. But I just wanted to make a wee plug for Sam was talking about citizen science a little bit. We really rely upon your input. You know, if any of you are lucky enough to hear or see a corncrake this year, please tell us about it. We have a Report a Corncrake webpage, which we'll share afterwards. So yeah, we would love to hear. It really helps us to target our work, and in some cases, you know, we don't know corncrakes or where you hear them, so we need your input.
Thank you, Tara. So just before we go, there are 3 things that you can do to help, and we put them in the chat, and we'll also send them out in the email that comes out afterwards. 3 ways you can 3 simple ways to help migratory birds. Consumer power, use your power to support products that help migratory birds, like our RSPB Gola chocolate or our Bird and Wild coffee that are available in the RSPB online shop. Anyone attending these webinars can get a 20% discount. So you'll see the discount code in the chat. Help nature where you live. Our Nature on Your Doorstep page is full of wildlife-friendly activities that you can do at home. Or join a local wildlife conservation group like your local RSPB group to get involved. Again, link available in the chat. Now, I'd like to say a massive thank you to all our speakers who put so much work into presenting and answering questions today. That's been absolutely wonderful. I'd also like to thank particularly Joss Ashpole, Guy Anderson and Nick Williams, who have worked incredibly hard behind the scenes, pulling all these events together, getting all this content for us. And of course, thank you to the events team, who without them, these events would not run at all. They do some wonderful work, really hard behind the scenes, pulling the whole things together. And thank you for watching. Thank you for sticking with us for an hour or for 4 hours if you sat through the entire series. And we will, as I say, make these sessions available on YouTube. Thank you very much and goodbye.